Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Listen to Pavarotti.
Can I be your superhero?
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I'm your host, Pavarotti, and I'm here to discuss the Idaho 4Ks. And you know, when I first put out the video the other day after we got the autopsy report and I tried to utilize super grok and try to make sense of everything, I probably did us all a disservice because even though I explicitly said, I mean, this is AI, I don't know if it's right or not, using the AI to show the wounds and let it do the interpretation was obviously a bad idea, because I see a lot of people having conversations probably around some of the things that I showed. And until you actually really dive in and start breaking down everything in these autopsy reports, I mean, by the size of the wounds and the placement of the wounds, I mean, you can't possibly know all the intricacies of what really happened. AI is ridiculously dumb. But I'm hearing these conversations about these massive wounds on Ethan and all this, and it's just not right. So I've got to right my wrong. And I have probably spent more time than anybody should have spent on all of the wounds on every one of the victims in this autopsy report. But by doing that, though, I had to do it because I know that the most critical evidence in the case was the DNA breakdown, all the evidence from the crime scene. And I spent a lot of time on that to make sure I got it perfect. And I had to do the same thing on the autopsies, because when you correlate the two, it tells the story. And what I've got to do in this one, though, is I've got to really tell you the true story around the wounds on Ethan, because it's not what you think. And once you do what I've done, if you was to do it with every one of the victims, it's going to actually tell you what I believe is the critical information about these situations, down to the weapons that were used on each victims, what likely perpetrator attacked more than one victim, and much, much more. This is all my humble opinion based on my inadequate capabilities and experience in this matter, and just my self-education on these topics since we got this report. But let me show you what I got. If you have any disagreements with me, please put them in my comments, because it does help me to get better at what I do, because I want to be accurate. Let's roll. Okay, here's the factual breakdown of Ethan's wounds. Starting with stab and incise wounds of the head and neck. 4 in total. The first one, though, is on the right parietal scalp, above the right ear, is an approximately 1.5 by 1/4 inch linear stab wound oriented from 7 to 1 o'clock. So this is a stab wound that goes in over Ethan's right ear. It's oriented from 7 to 1 like this. It's only 1.5 inches wide, but what it's going to do is it's not stabbing into Ethan's head. All right. It's going just under the skin, and it's going towards the scalp. Now, the skin of the head is very elastic and stretchy. So this is a 7-inch deep wound track, but because the skin is stretchy, a 4-inch blade is absolutely capable of causing this wound, because you're going to stretch the skin as it goes in. And you can see that, let's see, 7 o'clock in is square, 1 o'clock in is sharp. It's got a discontinuous 1/16 red marginal abrasion, which means 1/16 is the width of the serrades on the knife that was causing this. But it also has a 1.5 to 1.5 inch triangular abraded red contusion. So it's a red triangular bruise, which tells you that the guard of the knife was a triangle likely, and it was pushing the blade. So this is absolutely indicative of a blade a lot shorter than 7 inches on this wound. That's one. Over and over throughout all of the autopsies, you see the pathologists mentioning these discontinuous 1/16 or 1/8 inch red marginal abrasions. These are all indicative of serrated edge blades. Most knives, like this serrated edge, partially serrated K-bar knife, has 1/16 serrades. That's how wide their actual serrades are. So it's consistent between the K-bar with serrades and other knives. Now, as I'm going to show you in the end, there's no way a K-bar created all of these injuries across the victims. I've narrowed it down to 4 knives, and I believe there was 4 knives used in the attack, one on each victim, and one of them was used on 2 of the victims. But it is consistent with the serrades on a K-bar and many other knives that would have serrades. However, you'll find most of the wounds, like on Maddie, are described as having fine striations. That's indicative of another type of serrated blade, like the kitchen knife that's 8 inches in length, just like the one they found in the gutter at Kopaka's apartment. And I know I've listened to people talk about that, and yeah, the person said that he was cleaning Kopaka's apartment. He looked out the window in Kopaka's apartment into the gutter right in front of the window, and that's where he'd seen the knife blade. And yes, it says Brent Kopaka in the report. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out it's blacked out Brent Kopaka. It says BK. It's his apartment complex, and you know he's talking about Kopaka. So I don't understand how anybody even can argue that. I mean, that was, they got body cam of it. They got police reports of it. Anyway, back to Ethan. His next wound is a curvilinear wound on the left parietal scalp above and behind the left ear. This one is 2 by 3/16 inch, and it's a curvilinear inside wound. It does have the 1/16 red marginal abrasion, again, indicating a serrade. And an curvilinear is just a curved cut right here on Ethan's left parietal scalp. And this is not a, not a life-threatening injury. It's 1 inch deep. Wound 3. Wound 3 is a stab wound on the left lateral cheek, anterior to the left ear. So right up here, it is a 12 and 6. See 12 to 6 here on the clock. But the 12 end is sharp and the 6 inch is squared. And again, it's only 1 inches wide, and you can't tell how deep it goes because of the oral cavity. So probably a fairly shallow wound, I would imagine, but we don't know. Wound 4. This is a stab wound on Ethan's neck. This one would have been fatal. On the left neck, it's a 1 1/4 by 1/2 inch linear stab wound, oriented from 10 to 4, 10 to 4, 10 o'clock end is squared, the 4 o'clock end is sharp, and it doesn't give you any kind of indication on this one about any type of serrades, but it does tell you the left jugular vein is perforated, so it would be a fatal blow. It would have taken a little bit, but it would have been a fatal blow. But the key to this is it's 1.5 inches deep. You cannot have a clip point K-bar 1.5 inches deep on a stab wound and have a squared end at 4 o'clock. As you can see, here's the clip point on the K-bar, and at 1.5 inches, it is a sharp on both sides blade. So this would have had to been sharp and sharp. This is not a clip point K-bar that created this wound. And the clip point actually goes to 2 inches before it becomes squared. So that's impossible to be a K-bar. Wound 5. This was another fatal wound. This was a stab right here that got his internal jugular, subclavian vein, subclavian artery. So this was the fatal wound that caused all the blood, and it's a 4 inch deep stab. It's a 9 o'clock at one end, 3 o'clock at the other end, and it says the other end is rounded because you can see it's a 2.5 inch by 1 inch stab wound, which means it likely twisted. There isn't any knives 2.5 by 1 inch. This is a twisted wound that made it look bigger than it was. But it does have an abraded tail extending laterally. A braided tail is a way to indicate serrades. And it's 4 inches deep, so the depth of that, either a K-bar or another type of knife, 4 inches, you can't tell the difference with the sharp and the squared ends. So, but that is the fatal wound for Ethan. The one before it, this one would have been fatal given enough time. This one would have been fatal fairly quickly. Now, wounds 6, 7, and 8. These are wounds 6, 7, and 8, y'all. these 3 wounds across his fingers. On the dorsal aspect of the right hand, the outside of the right hand, at the base of the index finger, the 4th finger, and the 5th finger. So index, 4th, 5th. They're superficial incised wounds measuring 1/8 of an inch by 1/2 of an inch and 1/2 inch respectively. So that means this one at the index finger likely is only 1/8 of an inch, just a little scrape. The other 2 are 1/2 inch that goes across the fingers. You know, it's some type of defensive wound. It does show regular edges indicating serrades, but this is 3 of the wounds on Ethan right here. Wound 9 is a little cut on his palm, obvious defensive wound. On the palmar aspect of the right hand, at the hypothenar eminence, which is the base of the palm, is a superficial 3/8 inch linear incise wound. So just a little superficial cut right here, 3/8 of an inch, tiny, approximately 1/16 inch deep. So just a little nick. Wound 10. On the ventral left wrist is a transversely oriented, transversely means horizontal, and it's a 1 3/4 by 3/8 inch linear incise wound with a superficial 1/2 inch tail extending medially, and a 1/2 inch by 1 3/4 inch incised and abraded tail extending proximally from the lateral end of the wound. A braided tail means serrated edge, but you're only talking about a 1 3/4 inch cut, defensive wound, obviously, with a couple of tails that are scratches. Abrasions means scraped skin. It's only a 1/2 inch deep, so just a small defensive wound. The next one is just a little defensive cut on his left dorsal aspects, left knuckle, his left index finger knuckle. At the base of the index finger is just a 1/2 inch superficial incise wound, 1/16 inch deep. So just a little cut scrape right here on his knuckle is a wound. Wound number 12. This one is interesting. You can see where it's at on the medial right thigh, the inner right thigh, right over that femoral artery, is a 9/16 by 1/16 inch stab wound oriented from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock. It's only an inch deep. You can't have oh look, both ends are sharp. This is a different weapon. This is a different weapon because it's 1 inch deep, both ends are sharp. This one is consistent with the clip point. It is a different weapon than the weapon that stabbed Ethan in his neck, 1.5 inches. This was squared at 4 o'clock. Squared at 10, and the 4 o'clock end is sharp at 1.5 inches. It's not a clip point. Completely different knife at 1.5 inches deep than the knife that stabbed Ethan right here, 1 inch deep. Both ends are sharp. It's not the same knife, but this one has minimally hemorrhagic wound tracks, which means this is likely a post-mortem wound. It didn't bleed hardly at all when they stabbed him. This is somebody else coming up with this different knife after it's over and stabbing Ethan in basically his femoral artery, 1 inch deep, probably just to make sure that he's no longer alive, in my opinion. Wound 13, this is the largest wound on Ethan by far. It's a 4 inch by 1 inch linear incise wound across the top of his right knee right here. But it's 4 inches by 1 inch, just a cut across his right knee. It's 1 1/4 inches deep, and it's just a cut. That's it, just a slash. This one is another post-mortem wound, minimally hemorrhagic wound track on the back of Ethan's right calf. And it went 3.5 inches deep, so you can't tell what kind of knife caused it, but it's oriented from 12 to 6. The 12 end is squared, the 6 end is sharp, either the clip point or a standard knife without the double sharp blade at 3.5 inches. You can't tell the difference. But it was post-mortem, minimally hemorrhagic wound track. So Ethan had 2 post-mortem wounds in his legs, and the only other wounds that Ethan had was 15, 16, and 17, which was the wounds that we've already covered in depth, which are the cut in A. But people think that these wounds are so large. This is the actual size of these 3 cuts right here on the back of his thigh. Look, they're only 2.5, 2.25, and 1.25 inches. They're barely bigger than the knife blade. So when you look at Ethan's overall injuries, I mean, it's quite shocking how few there are. He's got two, one that was a stab in the top of the head that went along the scalp underneath the skin. One was a curved linear wound on the other side. He had a shallow stab, we think, in his cheek here because we don't know the depth because of the oral cavity. He had his two fatal wounds that really weren't that deep, but they cut his subclavian artery and vein. Somebody knew what they were doing here with Ethan. And then other than that, he only had a scrape on his wrist, a cut on his other wrist, a little cut on his left knuckle, and on his right hand, he had 3 little cuts on his fingers. And then on his leg, he had a slash on his knee, the 3 specific cuts on the back of his thigh here. And then he had 2 likely post-mortem stabs here and here after the fact. That's it. That's it on Ethan. So we got to, the AI thing was neat at first and told us a little bit and taught us a lot, but we need to get away from it now because it's confusing everybody, I believe. So in the end, when you really look at just specifically for Ethan, I mean, it's clear to me that was a very, very experienced person. They went in there with a couple of surgical strikes, and that was the death blows on Ethan. But you can clearly see that he at least tried to block some of the strikes. He has defensive wounds. And when you look at the defensive wounds across the victims, I mean, Ethan's got defensive wounds, even though they're minimal. Xana has so many you can barely even count them. And you can clearly see where Xana got those defensive wounds as you look at the crime scene and where she fought her way across. You can even tell when each one of the wounds happened, in my opinion, because of the things that had to happen before the next stage. Then you go up to Maddie. Maddie has no defensive wounds on her right hand whatsoever. I had somebody say, well, maybe she used her right hand to try to, cover her body after she was being attacked. Well, if that was the case, then she would still have defensive wounds on her right hand because they were stabbing at her chest. She has 10 on her left arm from her deltoid all the way to her hand where she had 5 of those defensive wounds. And I will mention that is the hand that they were really interested in the DNA under her fingernails. Q13.1 was her left hand. Maddie tried to fight off the attacker. The only person in the entire case that does not have any defensive wounds is Kaylee. Kaylee has a cut on her elbow, and that is it as far as wounds on her hand, except for her fist, which apparently Kaylee got a punch in on one of these folks because she has contusions and abrasions all across her knuckles where it looks like she nailed one of them. That's coming to you soon. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Post your comments, thoughts, criticisms. Till next time, Pavarotti's out.